Our next speaker is Jordan Baer. He's an assistant professor of art history at the University of Toronto. While pursuing his graduate work at Columbia University, Jordan also served as a research fellow here at the Metropolitan Museum in the Department of Photographs. And in fact, he was one of the first people I talked to about the exhibition, Faking It. And he was very contributed a lot in the early formation of the show, and then continued to contribute many excellent short essays to the exhibition catalog itself. His scholarship focuses on the historical intersection of photography, knowledge, and belief. And his writing has appeared in various journals, including History of Photography, Cabinet, Book Forum, and Grey Room. And he is working on a book, has a book that is ready to be published on the knowledge and belief in photography in the 19th century. Today, he will be speaking about a 20th century topic, however. We'll be looking at news photography and particularly the early 20th century form of the photo illustration. The title of his talk is Indexical Fingers, How the Photo Diagram Points the Way. Please welcome Jordan Baer.
Thank you, Mia, for the introduction and the invitation, and congratulations on this fantastic show. The flowering of the picture press in the 1920s was characterized by a particularly flexible relationship to accuracy, a trait which made these venues hospitable to some extraordinary inventiveness with the putatively objective medium of photography. The first of these publications, New York's Illustrated Daily News, with its mélange of scandals, public and private, created a successful formula that was soon imitated by the Evening Graphic and by William Randolph Hearst's Daily Mirror. The photographically saturated newspapers of this era sought to balance readers' thirst for images of death and destruction with the inevitable belatedness of the photographer's arrival on the scene, and accomplished this with the refinement of a particular genre that I'd like to speak about today, called the photo diagram. Though the tabloid papers were pioneers in the inundation of their pages with photographs, by the 20s they were emulated by mainstream publications in serving their readers and viewers a steady diet of post-facto reconstructions of catastrophic accidents and grisly discoveries. These images, more often than not, were insufficiently decipherable to serve the evidentiary claims for which they were adduced, and an elaborate repertoire of arrows, daggers, circles, and crosses were graphically added in paint or ink by hand to help guide the viewer's attention to the salient detail. One widely used instructional manual prepared by a team of newspaper editors and photographers made the nature and purpose of this sacrifice plain, asserting that, quote, if a picture contains too much confusing detail in the midst of which are news figures in action, any objectionable detail may simply be obliterated. In this strangely hybrid idiom of the photo diagram, photography's indexicality and its multiplicity seek reconciliation in ways that indicate something of the historical instability of photographic referentiality. It also provides an important perspective on the tension between graphical mark and image in the digital world, a durability which suggests that this relationship is never merely a question of technological capacities, but rather of photography's cultural position. The history of photography is, of course, replete with instances in which the need to make a photograph legible to a broadly dispersed audience vied with the assertion of non-intervention that was required to maintain the indexical sanctity of that image. In the case of a photograph of a historical event or a microphotograph of bacteria, the pure photograph might be illegible, containing a surfeit of irrelevant data or an insufficient prioritization of the key phenomenon being represented. However, the insertion of supplementary graphical emphases or information that are clearly external to the photographic process would clarify the image only at the cost of contaminating that very special state of mechanical purity under whose aegis the photo was being proffered as evidence. The peculiar interaction between the image and the graphical mark is so potentially instructive because it illuminates a fundamental incommensurability of photography's two most frequently imputed characteristics: its indexical proximity to its referent, on the one hand, and the dispersed situation of its multiplicity, on the other. While the former seems like connective tissue or an umbilical cord to wed the photograph to that which it represents, the fundamental modes of distribution through which photographs became available to all but their most temporally and spatially immediate audiences pull at that cord with the full force of modern technology. This is a conceptual tension at the very heart of the press photograph, one which is perhaps uniquely illuminated by the crucial and largely overlooked artifact of the photodiagram. The most photographed investigation of the early 20th century was characterized by a problematic relationship to the reliability both of photographic referentiality and also some of its metaphorical embodiments that many critics have deployed. When the infant son of America's beloved aviator, Charles Lindbergh, was kidnapped from his parents' sprawling country estate in the spring of 1932, the always acerbic journalist H.L. Mencken apocryphally quipped that it was the biggest story since the resurrection, a witticism marked by a certain uneasiness about the metaphysical dimensions of the corporeal remnant. The disappearance of the eaglet from his cozy nest launched an intensive search which, after the expenditure of all available resources, yielded only a frustrating cul-de-sac of useless clues. The kidnappers had left behind their marks, but these were ultimately insufficient to save the life of the child. When two sets of fingerprints were located on the windowsill outside the boy's nursery, hopes were raised and then dashed. As one newspaper headline reported, "Marks cannot be matched to any criminal." Later, footprints were seen leading away from the scene of the crime, which were followed to the main highway about a half a mile from the house, where they suddenly disappeared. A photograph accompanied the coverage, showing police investigators hunched over, making their own photographs of these footprints. Despite the high hopes that the child could be recovered alive, these seemingly secure traces of the criminal were ultimately unable to solve the crime in time. These favored metaphors for photographic referentiality, the fingerprint and the footprint, had failed in their supposedly direct relationship to their creators, and so too would the photograph itself convey its own inability to secure a solution to the crime through contiguity with its referent. When the decaying corpse of the younger Lindbergh was finally located months later, quite serendipitously by a passing laborer and his boss, a newspaper photographer was dispatched to help recreate the scene of discovery. We note the two men fixed on the empty space, one of them pointing out the now vacant place of discovery. The referent in this photograph has become unmoored, for the child's corpse had been removed immediately after the original discovery that this photograph reenacts. The passerby now points at nothing, indicates only that which traditional referential modalities had been unable to locate. This most notorious crime was one in which the index is split apart from its maker, in which the fingerprint belongs to nobody, the footprint leads nowhere, and the photograph arrives only in time to fabricate the discovery of an already departed victim. The photograph and its investigative metaphors were indeed joined conceptually in this moment, but not as exemplars of the invulnerable bond between the trace and its referent, but rather of the dissolution of that bond, of the very tenuous contiguity between the two. The impotent indication of the two men, in its belatedness and its very fundamental non-referentiality, belie the limitations of photographs to serve the basic functions of indexicality so often foisted upon them. But the quiver full of arrows, daggers, and crosses that were deployed in many competing photographs introduced their own kinds of ambivalence into this project. The short-lived but enormously influential journal Document, in this journal, Georges Bataille, its intellectual shepherd, wrote a review essay of an equally transient but substantial book, the anonymously published X Marks the Spot, Chicago Gang Wars in Pictures. A gruesome collage of photographs and newspaper-like reportage detailing the more unsavory chapters in the rise of the king of gangland, Al Capone. The volume was quickly pulled from newsstands by Scarface's goons. It was remarkably appropriate, then, that Bataille would write about a text and an object that had ceased to exist, for this was precisely the problem raised in the book's photographs. The X in question, according to the book's nameless author, has undergone an important transformation. In addition to publishing extraordinarily grisly photographs of corpses, X Marks the Spot makes a specialty of returning us to the scene of the crime that has already unfolded, recreated with the presence of those officials who discovered the body of evidence, often pointing towards the spot to clarify for the viewer its precise location. Beyond the direction provided by the finger of the law, the photographs have been manipulated to insert a graphical white X over the spot. More precisely, though, that X is a cross patee, a mark traditionally used on maps to indicate the presence of a Christian burial site, deployed here with a certain irreverent irony. One caption asserted that, quote, X marks the spot where Anton's body was found after a long search. It was buried in quicklime. Anton made a nuisance of himself, trying to get out of the racket. The referential architecture here is surprisingly complicated for a work that seems to rely upon the neutrality of the photographic medium to make its case. What we are presented with is a recreation of the scene of discovery of the residue of an act that had even then already taken place, the discoverer of which returns to point his index finger not at that residue, but at an empty space in the dirt, which has even later been replaced by a figure marking the former relevance of the spot. But what is the status of photographic documentation when its object is already missing and replaced by proxies that only serve to destabilize the camera's transparent capacities by pointing precisely to the place of its insufficiency, of its not being quite in time? The substitution of the handmade X for the corpse shatters the literal and metaphorical ideals of contiguity between referent and photographic representation. For the introduction of a clearly external graphic into the photo not only violates the impermeability of the photograph's referential frame with a non-photographic mark, but it aims this mark at the absence of the referent to which the photograph's internal population fraudulently gestures. As the repertoire of graphical editions proliferated and matured, the pressure on the photograph's indexicality increased proportionately. In the rise of the full-blown photodiagram, the temporal failures of the photograph to arrive in time to document the unfolding narrative are rectified, but only at the further expense of the eroding indexical privilege of the medium. As destabilizing as the X of the Chicago gang pictures was, it constituted a relatively restrained intrusion into the scene. In a contemporary image, the story of a Denver nurse who kills the fiancé who left her at the altar before attempting to do herself in is told with considerable graphical panache. Here, the scene of the crime is reconstructed in a narrative form. A hand-drawn representation of the murderess is montaged onto the blood-soaked bed from which her actual body had been hastened to the operating theater. She grasps the revolver in her right hand, a delicate puff of smoke emanating from its barrel. Yet this smoking gun was hardly decisive within the logic of the image, for we see on the floor another iteration of the weapon, marking the location where the woman had hurled it. And this iconic representation is itself reiterated in the form of the now familiar cross patee, located directly below the graphical gun. The temporal inadequacies of the photograph could hardly be more melodramatically revealed. The bizarre multiplicity of revolvers and the seemingly extraneous cross articulate a sense of narrative progress, but only at the expense of any notion of indexical linkage. The legibility of the nurse's tale is secured almost exclusively through the additive drawing, while the photographic image is relegated to a mere backdrop. By the 1950s, we note the frequency with which the entire representational scenes have been conjured up, where previously a nominally neutral mark would have sufficed. The inventive staff at the San Francisco Examiner, for instance, found itself confronted with a dilemma when, in 1953, an evidently maniacal motorist zoomed out of the Broadway tunnel in his stolen car with sufficient velocity to strike a pedestrian, sever his body in two, and careen down one of the city's iconic hills, smashing through the front window of a bakery. The difficulty for the creators of that newspaper's photo diagram was the surfeit of indices implicated in the crash that, paradoxically, only served to saturate the picture with the very kind of graphical guideposts that obliterate the photograph's indexicality. A solid arrow in black and white pigment is applied to the surface of the photograph and reenacts the path of the death car, emerging from the tunnel and passing to the left of an actual automobile present at the time of this belated photograph. Darting through the intersection, the stolen car materializes for the first time, striking a graphically added pedestrian whose disconnected body flies in two directions indicated by a pair of dotted lines. At the base of these, two crosses repose where the unfortunate man's fragmented corpse came to rest, one being there. The solid vector continues down the hill where the auto reappears amidst the ripple of the shop window, its doors having swung open to emphasize the suddenness of the vehicle's arrest. The numbers 1, 2, and 3 of the photo diagram are encased in white orbs and hover over the scene and correspond to 3 moments described in the narrative caption accompanying the image. With one exception, the photographic element of this ensemble gives little evidence of the trail of death that the Examiner sought to show its readers. The only trace of what had occurred is the damage to the bakery shop window where the automobile had lodged itself, with which the painted car meshes somewhat uneasily, since it hardly seems weighty enough to wreak such havoc. Indeed, the passers-by and traffic in the photograph give no indication that anything so dramatic might be unfolding, for the simple reason that nothing is unfolding in the moment of the photograph. We see here the fundamental conflict registered quite unswervingly in this juxtaposition of two incongruous representational approaches, of an indexical but insignificant photographic scene and a legible yet referentially dubious one. However we might disparage the sometimes clumsy intermingling of photographic and hand-drawn elements in the photo diagrams, we can say that it is oftentimes that very clumsiness which proclaims the materiality of the photograph most directly. They are three-dimensional, a fact signaled by the obviously physical layering of representation, in which the drawing is in front of or on top of the photographic field. One technically maladroit but very imaginative photodiagram of a jailbreak from the Alameda County lockup makes particular use of this spatiality by merging the photographic exterior of the prison with a drawn cutaway view. Although the drawing is glued onto the photo, it announces itself facetiously as being underneath the photographic surface, inside of the structure whose facade is rendered photographically. Similarly, in the case of the homicidal nurse we saw a moment ago, the perspectival construction of the photographic space is dismantled by the drawn figures, which seem, as indeed they were, to have been placed on top of a flat surface, rather than existing in a coherent spatial relationship with their milieu. They are alternately and incommensurably surfaces for writing and drawing, and depicted spaces deep enough to contain the photographic scene. The proliferation of layers and surfaces, of the accumulation of paper, ink, and paint on both the recto and verso of the photodiagrams insist upon their materiality and the histories that attach themselves to objects. For an indication of the digital accommodation of mark and image, let us return once more to the scene of the crime of the century by examining another photograph that, like the scene of the discovery already addressed, is not a photograph of the infant Charles Lindbergh Jr. We might reasonably suspect that the shadow of an airplane cast upon the ground to the right of the photograph is a trace of an airplane that carries the senior Lindbergh, but it isn't. Nor does this indexical trace of the airplane, in its vertiginous transformation into a black cross planted in the ground, mark the presence of the younger Lindbergh. It is rather the white cross to its left that marks the location where the corpse of Charles Lindbergh Jr., then and forever just 2 years old, was spotted by a passing laborer amidst the brambles of the countryside. The white cross is the child's grave, we would say metaphorically, or more soberly, marks the location of the discovery of his corpse from above, from the viewpoint of the news photographer who hired the airplane whose shadow is cast in the picture. And that shadow, or black cross, is the guarantor of the presence and presentness of the photographer, while the white cross, graphically added, must suffice as the evidence of the location of the child's body. The shadow's intimate connection to the making of the photograph condemns that white cross, the raison d'etre of the entire picture, to a subsidiary evidentiary status. But the black and white crosses of the image are overshadowed by a third eruption that brings us to the very crux of the matter. Emblazoned across the center of the image is a linguistic assertion of property rights, a digital watermark declaring that the Associated Press is the owner of this representation. This device is employed today by a rapidly increasing share of repositories of photographic imagery with the aim of making such images available for browsing and purchasing. The prominence of the watermark is intended to disfigure the picture and to dissuade the unauthorized reproduction of the image by making it ostensibly unusable. There is, however, a contradiction inherent in this approach, for the assertion of the image's authenticity, that is, its authorized reproduction from its legitimate source, comes only by way of making that image into something entirely different. The indexical relation of the photograph to its archive can only be securely claimed by transforming the photograph into an image which makes it unlike its original, distinct from the property that is claimed. The way we know for certain that we are looking at an authentic iteration of the archival image is, paradoxically, not through a visual identity between the two, but rather by confronting an image that has been corrupted by the addition of the archive's graphical logo. Now, for an immodest fee, the repository owning the photograph on which this digitization is based will grant the user a limited set of rights, the most formally consequential of which is the removal of that watermark. Yet the watermark would not really be removed, since it is not really on anything to begin with, so much as it would be rendered non-visual, encoded digitally with a unique serial number indicating the identity of the user. This digital fingerprint, as it is regularly called, is again intended to ensure that the copy has been authorized, is not itself copied or redistributed. Like its namesake in the real world of real crime, this fingerprint is the putative storehouse of individual identity, and the image in which it is embedded is accordingly a unique one. We have in these digital images a new kind of referentiality, in which the encoded data refers back not to the scene represented, but to the transaction between the archive and the authorized user of the image. This conception of photographic imagery attests to the long-standing incompatibility of the medium's indexicality with its multiplicity, and the precedent of the photodiagram here, I think, is instructive. The graphical supplements that we noted in the newspaper photographs announce their constructedness by virtue of their materiality, by penetrating the inviolate safehouse of photographic objectivity with their crosses and arrows. For the sake of the legibility that was necessitated by their modes of distribution, these amalgamations were prepared to renounce their claims to indexical integrity. The rationale was clearly articulated by one sanguine news photographer who wrote, "News photos are retouched to improve their copy value. This is the most important purpose of retouching. The purpose of such retouching is to produce not exaggerated effects, but natural effects." By copy value, this journeyman shutterbug meant the legibility of the photograph within the mechanical reproduction of the halftone process. But the term resonates pointedly with the balance sought by contemporary systems of photographic distribution, for which the dispersal of the copy is no longer a measure of success, but a metastasis to be contained. The demands placed upon the referential power of photography by the picture press tabloids of the 1930s for wide distribution and clear legibility, and those required by the era of licensed intellectual property, of a medium whose legibility is purposely scrambled in order to curtail distribution, may be seen as deeply antithetical, and certainly disparate economic, aesthetic, and moral valences have attended these two iterations. And yet, for all the apparent dissimilarity of the digital and analog incarnations of photography, it is in the interaction of the graphical and the iconic components that the special, if mutable, identity of photography has so regularly been thought to reside. That the persuasive power of the digital image might derive precisely from its unsettled impurity, from its strategic deployment of supplementary graphical marks, is the premise upon which the new visual economy of digital is based. The historical negotiation of the photographic image and the graphical mark has never been more pointed. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Well, I guess I'll just mention in reference to the Lindbergh baby case that in the exhibition, Faking It, there is the sort of denouement of this case there's a newspaper news service reconstruction of the execution of Bruno Hauptmann, who was the criminal convicted of the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. Now, we all know that cameras were not allowed in prison death chambers in the early 20th century in this country, so the photographers who created this actually reconstructed the scene by staging it with actors, having somebody sit in a chair that was turned into an electric chair, and then taking the actual heads of the people who were involved in this scene, which was Hauptmann and the prison warden, and pasting them onto the bodies of the actors, and then rephotographing it to create an illustration of this dramatic and sensationalist scene of the sort of end of final justice of the crime of the century. So when you go up at lunchtime, be sure to catch that. I guess my question for Jordan would be, how would viewers, at this time have looked differently at a picture, a photo illustration, a photo diagram of a car accident versus a drawing reconstructing the scene? Why bother even to use photography in this way when it would have been much more legible and much easier to just make a drawing of this car crash?
Yeah, I think it's a case of wanting to have one's cake and eat it too, which is that using the photograph, even if you're going to denigrate the main purpose for which photographs are used, or for which they're often offered, was still a powerful enough way of articulating the evidentiary quality of something. And so even though it is totally undercut by the addition of these graphical elements, in a way that's actually what's so fascinating about the show in general, which is, why is it that despite all of our understanding about not only the inherent stagedness of most photographs, but the manipulation involved in most photographs, why is it that there is this desire to invest photography with some sort of pure indexicality? We don't have a good answer, but clearly what's being worked out in these hybrids is the desire to balance that evidentiary status against the desire to make these things read as something, to provide information.
Alan?
This was the era of the rise of the detective novel and the crime magazine.
Yeah.
Many of whose illustrations also used those conventions, and in detective novels at the time, this no longer really happens, but there would often be these little diagrams, he entered here, this is where he killed her, this is how he made his escape, this is where he hid in the closet, etc. Right. So I suspect that the readers of these tabloid newspapers would have been accustomed to that kind of illustration and even that kind of hybrid also. I want to ask you a question, though, about newspaper practice, if you have any information about this, which is that as I look at the examples that you presented, with the little drawing of the nurse on the bed, or one of the felons, escaping from the prison cell, they look to me like cartoons. And I'm wondering if you know how it was in newspaper practice. What department handled that stuff? Did they call up the cartoonists and say, we need some felons and here's some information, or send up a print of the picture and say, we need something that fits this scale? Right. How exactly did that happen?
The only sources of information we have about that are the kind of instructional manuals that I quoted from. Those are always difficult as evidence because they might be aspirational rather than reflecting what actually went on. But for instance, this fantastic image, which is in the show, on the back of it, there's a significant amount of annotation by the examiner's art department. Now, whether that term denotes handwork or photography as well is sort of unclear. But these there are sort of remarkable additions that are made showing the way that cropping and also additions would have to be made in order to make this a legible photograph. It's hard to say specifically, though, how the division of labor would have been broken up.
think as an ex-photojournalist, I can answer that a little bit, at least
Right.
as the practice was when I was working there. And that is that there was a separate art department. In the case of our newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, it was next to us, it was attached. So that if a picture needed to be retouched in some way, it would be sent to that department, and you were really dependent on who was working that day to see the relative level of artistry that could be applied, say, to a reproduction of a car. It was done less and less, and part of the issues that came about in the newspaper business were how to deal with manipulated photography. And when I was there, the decision was that those pictures could only be put on the editorial page, even though we all understood that photographers always are manipulating one thing or another.
Right. Thank you. That's interesting.
So I was just curious about the conceptual apparatus for your paper, because you pose the manipulation, these additions, with the index as a vehicle to explain the referential authenticity of the photograph. But you also seem to step very close to dismantling the idea of the index as a guarantor of referentiality. And you've written elsewhere, quoting Joel Snyder, that it's an irrelevant concept anyway. Could you maybe state a little bit more about how you think that's still a useful concept or term to do the work that I think you're making it do here?
Yeah, thanks. I think the idea of the index, as it was articulated in the 1970s and has continued to lead its geriatric existence, is useful in some ways, but it needs to be understood as an historical variable. So the index, I think, has nothing to do with something imminent to photography. But I think that at different moments in history, the idea of something like the index has meant very important and different things to different people. And that as a tool historically for understanding the kind of belief structures that attend different photographs, that this idea of some sort of special linkage, some unbreakable bond between the photograph and the thing that it represents, that's useful. I think it's useful as a diagnostic of the beliefs of others throughout history about what photography is. But as some decisive smoking gun, as I say, I think it leaves a bit to be desired.
Thank you. This is about a photograph that you may or may not recall by Jacob Riis, which is called X Marks the Spot. And I'm wondering just about that whole phrase in the convention, X marks the spot. I don't know whether you can talk about the history of that, or whether that photograph, and I've always assumed that the X was put there by the police, but now I'm wondering whether it might have been added there by Riis in some way. But I don't know whether you can talk about that specific image or in general. About
Yeah. Well, my guess is the latter, that it was added it's part of the photographic process rather than part of staging that was then recorded by the photographic process. And the term, this is something I did try to ascertain, and it seems like the best that I can come up with is that it comes from cartography. And this strange symbol here, which Bataille refers to as an X and others refer to as a cross, is really neither of those things. It's a specific kind of cross that was used for representing where a Christian burial site would have existed. And that's a piece of information that would be of most use to people making maps. And so I suspect that in some abstract, if not etymological way that the phrase X marks the spot comes down to us from conventions of mapping.
You find it in Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped,
Mm.
or Treasure Island, not Kidnapped,
Mhm.
Treasure Island.
Right.
The phrase is there, so
Right.
it's in the vernacular.
Yeah.
It's not simply a cartographer convention.
Right.
I was just gonna follow up on that, and say with the treasure. I mean, when you look at the stereotypical pirate map, right? I mean, it's always that's the X, right, where you find the treasure. So there's also that illusion as well. But I wanted to make a couple of connections also between your two papers, because I mean, I also was struck by Robinson in relationship to when you talked about that artist who said that retouching is justified in the service of the achieving of natural effects. Well, that's exactly the same line that Robinson was using in Pictorial Effect in order to talk about why combination printing was legitimate in order to correct syntax errors. And so therefore, in order to achieve this more naturalistic depiction, it's all well and good. So I think there's a real continuity that exists between what Miles was talking about and what you're raising here.
Yeah, very much so. I think that what's fascinating is the persistence of this idea that although we invest so much in the referentiality of the photograph, there are moments when it needs to be made more referential than it is in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And that means making these kinds of additions, or in some cases making abstractions, so that the photograph looks like what we would imagine the real situation to look like, even when the photograph itself demonstrates that that real situation doesn't look like that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just had a little footnote. What was fascinating about the continuation of this kind of tabloid graphic practice is when, and the map-like aspect of this practice is when the global satellite pictures are used with these kind of graphics now as to make a case that they have these weapons or whatever. And it always struck me that there was this tabloid desperation about that maneuver. And your talk just made those connections, really.
Yeah, it's. I think it's certainly evocative of the famous Colin Powell moment at the UN, flushing his reputation down the toilet as he sort of gestures towards these images, which evidently show something, but I don't really know what they show, and they certainly didn't show what. Yeah, they show pointing, but they don't point at anything, unfortunately. Yeah.
So I'm really struck by the car accident image in particular because it reminds me of contemporary practices in actually litigation with animations and simulations and the multiple ways these are handled. So you sometimes get pure animated reconstructions. So the indexicality is gone in the sense that it's completely. I mean, it reads as an animation. Other times you get reconstructions with real cars, and it's still a reconstruction, but it's got a very different it's relationship. There's still overt staging, but it's got a different kind of indexicality, and sometimes you get hybrids. And I mean, this goes a little bit beyond what you were giving us here, but I wonder how those different versions get read by the viewer. That is, does the viewer see the staged version with real cars in the place of the accident and understand it differently than the purely animated version, or not? And I think that question goes straight to sort of where you ended with this notion that persuasiveness is sometimes produced through the hybrid rather than simply the indexical. And so I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, if you think about, I guess these two seem to be on a spectrum where some of these are meant to be read directly as saying something about what really happened, notwithstanding the overtly graphical additions and the supplements, and others are playing with that idea, like the smoking gun and the woman, right?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's, and, we're looking forward to hearing your talk this afternoon, because I think so much of the answer to that question depends upon what discourse the image is a part of and what the evidentiary structures of that discourse might be. So for, what counts as evidence for the readers of a tabloid, that's quite different from what counts as evidence in a courtroom in California. But what counts as evidence in a courtroom in California might not be the same thing as in Texas or in New York. And so there's, it's, I think, such a specific set of criteria that are brought to making that determination about whether something ought to be admissible or, in layman's terms, just convincing. And so I think, it's really the amazing variability of photography, that it can operate in all of these totally incommensurable contexts, providing different attestations of different facts, all the while supposedly constituting this coherent medium that we're also obsessed with.
Yes, one of the most highly indexed series of photos that I've ever seen, and I have not as yet seen the exhibition, so I don't know if they are actually present within the exhibition, is the group of photographs taken associated with the John F. Kennedy assassination. There were numerous photos of the Texas Book Depository, the path of the motorcade, the grassy knoll, and you mentioned abstractions before, the path of the mystery bullet, and so on and so forth. I was just wondering if you had any specific comments associated with that very highly indexed event.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually think about making that a sort of element of this discussion. I think, in a way, the underlying or straight images that those are based on are so deeply ingrained in our mind's eye that it's really quite difficult to think about them outside of the context that we have already thought about them in. So that's why I was somewhat hesitant to do that. But no, you're absolutely right that that was as major a context for deploying these kinds of hybrid solutions to a problem that was fundamentally unanswerable in a lot of ways.
In Christopher Lyman's very jejune debunking of Edward Curtis's work, one of the examples that he gives is actually an X marks the spot example in reverse. There's a photograph, an aerial, sort of overhead or aerial view of a crowd scene in which Curtis retouched out the suspenders of a man who's in the almost the dead center of the image.
Mm-hmm.
And this is indicated by Lyman as an example of his willingness to fudge the truth, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the picture, if you imagine or see a version of the image with the suspenders in, they form an exact X in the middle of the picture, which would be the first thing that anyone looking at this scene would look at and would assume, because this was done during the period of these conventions, the person would assume that the photographer wanted you to be looking right there.
Interesting.
And Curtis retouched it out, I think, to preserve, going back to what Miles was talking about, a kind of truth quotient to the image, rather than pointing to that indexically and saying, look at this one guy.
Yeah, I mean, it's only through manipulation that the photograph can be a reflection of the reality that the photographer wants it to be.
This is just a refinement in terminology that I'm thinking of, listening to these comments, that we can talk about the hybridity of this kind of form, but in another sense, it makes it might make more sense to talk about foreground and background, because what happens is there's a reversal here, that the indexical photograph, if we can use that term, is something that we normally assume to be what we're looking at. And when we see these diagrams superimposed upon it, that becomes the background. and really subsidiary to our view. So there's a real kind of like once that element enters the image, it immediately reverses our attention almost in a kind of flip gestalt way.
Yeah.
So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think that's right. And what's fascinating to me about this one and many of these is that graphical addition both makes us totally aware of the flatness of the thing that we're looking at, but it also has this presumption of showing us layers, showing us that there's something behind the photograph. That's the implication here, even though what we're actually seeing is in front of the photograph. So I think, perspectively and also in the way that we prioritize different levels of evidentiary status to these different media, I think it's quite fascinating. Yeah.